For 5 years, the world knew Amelia Hayes by one title. The quiet, unassuming wife of Wall Street tycoon Richard Sterling. When he publicly traded her for a lingerie model half her age, society whispered its pity, then promptly forgot her. But some people don't just fade away. They forge themselves in the fire of betrayal. Tonight, at the glittering St. Regis Philanthropy Gala, Richard stands ready to showcase his new prize. He is utterly unprepared for the woman who is about to walk through those doors, a woman he no longer recognizes on the arm of a man with the power to burn his entire world to the ground. The air in the St. Regis, New York's grand ballroom was thick with the scent of money and white roses. It was the annual Children's Foundation Gala, a night where the city's 1% gathered to write 7-figure checks, and more importantly, to be seen doing it. Richard Sterling stood near the sweeping marble staircase, a flute of vintage Dom Perignon in his hand, feeling the familiar intoxicating buzz of being at the center of his universe. Everything was perfect. His suit was a bespoke Brioni, the Patek Philippe on his wrist was a subtle nod to his latest market conquest, and the woman on his arm was by all accounts flawless. Kimberly Duval was 24 years old, a confection of honey blonde hair, surgically perfected features, and a voracious ambition that Richard found exhilarating. Her dress, a shimmering crimson number by Zuhair Murad, clung to her body like a second skin, and was cut so low it was causing a delightful stir among the stuffier old money dames. "Darling, you've outdone yourself," Richard murmured, his hand possessively on the small of her back. "The Vanderbilts can't stop staring." Kimberly preened her smile, as dazzling and cold as the diamond necklace, a recent gift from Richard, that adorned her throat. "Let them stare. They're just jealous their husbands still have them in last season's Chanel. You have impeccable taste, Ricky." His name on her lips, a syrupy Ricky, was a small, private thrill. It was a name no one else used. It made him feel young, powerful, not like the name his ex-wife used to use. Richard, always so formal, so bland. Just the thought of Amelia sent a faint, unpleasant shiver through him. It had been 2 years since the divorce was finalized, a messy affair he'd orchestrated to be as swift and financially advantageous to himself as possible. He had been generous, of course. He'd let her keep the modest Connecticut house they'd first bought, a place he now considered a quaint relic, and set up a trust that would keep her comfortable. Comfortable but not powerful. Not enough to ever be in his orbit again. Amelia Hayes. Even her maiden name was plain. She had been the perfect starter wife. Stable, intelligent, in a quiet, academic sort of way, and utterly unambitious socially. She had proofread his business plans in the early days, managed their homes with quiet efficiency, and sat patiently through dinners where she contributed little more than a polite smile. But as Sterling developments reached the stratosphere, her quiet grace had begun to feel like a lead weight. He needed a woman who shined, who commanded a room, who was a testament to his success. Amelia, with her sensible cardigans and her preference for a library over a red carpet, had become an embarrassment. "Is that Charles Weatherby over there?" Kimberly whispered, nudging him. "Heard his fund lost $500 million on that Singapore deal." "Serves him right," Richard scoffed, taking a triumphant sip of champagne. "He didn't listen to me. I told him the market was too volatile. He loved this, the gossip, the power dynamics, the scent of victory and failure mingling with the perfume." His friend, a real estate mogul named Patrick O'Connell, clapped him on the shoulder. "Richard, you magnificent bastard. She's stunning." He nodded towards Kimberly, his eyes doing a quick, appreciative sweep. "The best, Patrick." Only the best, Richard grinned. Speaking of the best, Patrick said, lowering his voice slightly. Did you hear your ex might be here tonight? Richard's smile tightened. Amelia here. Don't be ridiculous. This isn't a bake sale for the local library. She wouldn't know what to do with herself. I don't know, man. The invitation list is public. Saw an Amelia Hayes on it. Figured it had to be her. Richard laughed, a short, dismissive sound. Probably a clerical error. Or maybe she bought a single ticket and is hiding by the coat check. Honestly, I hope she's here. It'll give her a chance to see what she lost. Kimberly, sensing a conversation that didn't revolve around her, tightened her grip on his arm. Who's Amelia? She asked, her voice laced with a feigned innocence that Richard found charming. Nobody, my love, he said, turning to kiss her temple. Just a ghost from a past life. He scanned the room, a king surveying his court, feeling invincible. The ballroom was filled with the titans of industry, the heirs of dynasties, the new gods of tech. And he, Richard Sterling, was one of them. He had shed his boring past and emerged more powerful than ever. Tonight was his coronation with Kimberly as his queen. Nothing and no one could possibly spoil it. The symphony of chatter and clinking glasses was at its peak when a subtle shift occurred. It wasn't a loud noise or a sudden announcement. It was a gradual change in the room's energy, a current that started near the grand entrance and flowed inward, turning heads as it went. It began as a murmur, a ripple of curiosity. A hush fell over the cluster of socialites near the door, their conversation on summering in the Hamptons dying on their lips. The silence spread contagious and absolute until even Richard, holding court by the champagne fountain, felt its pull. "What the hell is going on?" he muttered, annoyed at the interruption. He followed the gaze of nearly everyone in the room, his eyes landing on the arched entrance. And then he saw her. For a disorienting second, his brain refused to process the image. The woman standing there was familiar, yet utterly foreign. She had Amelia's high cheekbones and the gentle curve of her jaw. But that was where the resemblance ended. The Amelia he remembered wore beige. She wore her mousy brown hair in a sensible shoulder-length cut. She hunched her shoulders ever so slightly, as if trying to make herself smaller. This woman did not hunch. She stood with a poised, leonine grace, her shoulders back, her chin held high. Her hair was a rich, dark chestnut, styled in elegant cascading waves that fell over one shoulder. She was wearing a gown of deep emerald silk, a custom creation by Schiaparelli, that was both classic and daring. It didn't scream for attention like Kimberly's crimson dress. It commanded it with a quiet, confident authority. Around her neck was a single breathtaking piece, a collar of Colombian emeralds and diamonds that glittered under the chandeliers, a piece so significant it could only have come from a private collection, perhaps even a royal one. But it was her eyes that struck Richard the most. The same intelligent grey eyes he once knew were now alight with a fire he'd never seen before. A cool, self-possessed confidence that seemed to assess the room and find it slightly wanting. This was not the ghost of his past. This was a renaissance. Kimberly gasped beside him, a small, sharp sound of disbelief. "Is that her?" Your ex-wife, Richard, couldn't answer. His throat was dry. It was as if someone had punched the air from his lungs. It was Amelia, but an Amelia who had been redrawn by a master artist. And then he saw the man whose hand rested gently proprietorially in the small of her back. He was tall, with silvering temples, and a face that looked as if it had been carved from granite. He wore a simple, perfectly tailored tuxedo, but his presence filled the doorway, eclipsing everyone around him. There was no flash, no pretense, just an aura of immense, unshakable power. Richard recognized him instantly, though they had never met. Every major player in global finance knew his face. It was Damien Chevalier. Not just a billionaire. The billionaire. A man whose wealth was so vast and old, it made people like Richard look like children playing with monopoly money. Chevalier's family had controlled European shipping and banking for centuries. His personal ventures into sustainable technology and private equity were the stuff of legend. He was a recluse, a phantom who rarely attended such public events. He moved markets with a single phone call and bought and sold entire corporations as a hobby. And he was looking down at Amelia with an expression of such profound adoration and tenderness that it made Richard's blood run cold, with a feeling he couldn't name, but it tasted like acid. Amelia leaned in and whispered something to Damien. He smiled a genuine warm smile that transformed his severe features, and then they began to move into the room. The crowd parted for them like the Red Sea. People who wouldn't give Richard the time of day without an appointment were suddenly scrambling to catch Damien Chevalier's eye. The murmuring started again, no longer just curious but frantic with speculation. That's Amelia Hayes, with Damien Chevalier. I thought she'd moved to the countryside to paint watercolors or something. My God, that necklace. It must be the Montclair emeralds. I thought they were in a vault in Geneva. Richard felt a hot, prickling sensation crawl up his neck. He was frozen in place, the champagne flute feeling impossibly heavy in his hand. This wasn't happening. This was a nightmare. His plain, boring, discarded wife had not only reappeared, but she had reappeared as a goddess on the arm of a man whose net worth was greater than the GDP of a small country. Their path through the ballroom was taking them directly towards his position. It was unavoidable. He could feel Kimberly trembling beside him, her entire body rigid with shock and fury. Her grand entrance, her perfect dress, her status as Richard's prize, it had all been rendered utterly insignificant in a matter of seconds. Amelia's eyes finally met Richard's across the shrinking space. There was no malice in her gaze, no triumph. There was something far worse, polite, distant recognition. The kind one might give to a former colleague or a distant acquaintance. As they came to a stop before him, Damien's hand still resting on her back, Amelia gave a small, serene smile. "Richard," she said, her voice smooth and even, betraying no hint of their shared, messy history. "What a surprise to see you here." The world seemed to slow down. The buoyant chatter of the Gala faded into a dull roar in Richard's ears. All he could focus on was the calm, collected face of the woman he had so thoroughly underestimated. "Amelia," he managed to say, his voice sounding strained and unfamiliar to his own ears. "You're here." "I sit on the board now," she replied simply, as if discussing the weather. "The Foundation's work in children's literacy is a particular passion of mine." The board. The thought was so preposterous that Richard almost laughed. The board of the Children's Foundation was a fortress of old money and corporate power. You didn't just join it. You were invited, courted, and your donation had to be astronomical. Damien Chevalier extended a hand, not to Richard, but to Kimberly, who was staring at Amelia as if she'd seen a spectre. "You must be Miss Duval," Damien said, his voice a low, cultured baritone. "A pleasure. My wife has told me so little about you." The words were polite, but the subtext was a scalpel. "Wife." The word hung in the air, glittering and sharp as Amelia's necklace. And the casual dismissive "so little" was a masterclass in social annihilation. It relegated Kimberly from a rival to a footnote. Kimberly, flustered, took his hand. Charmed, she stammered, her usual coquettish confidence completely gone. Finally, Damien turned his gaze to Richard. It was like being examined under a microscope. His eyes were a pale, piercing blue, and they held no warmth whatsoever. "Sterling," he said, his handshake firm and brief. The single word was a dismissal. He hadn't even called him Richard. "Chevalier," Richard replied, his hand feeling clammy. "Didn't expect to see you in New York. Amelia loves the city in the fall," Damien said, turning his attention back to his wife, his entire demeanor softening. "And what my wife loves, I find compelling." The message was clear. He wasn't here for business or for the gala. He was here for her. Just then a man Richard had been trying to get a meeting with for 6 months practically shoved him aside. It was Kenji Ishikawa, the notoriously elusive head of a Japanese tech conglomerate Richard was desperately courting for a major urban development project. "Mr. Chevalier." "What an unexpected honor," Ishikawa said, bowing slightly. He completely ignored Richard, his focus entirely on Damien. Kenji Damien greeted him warmly. "Good to see you. I'd like you to meet my wife, Amelia Hayes." Amelia smiled and inclined her head. "Mr. Ishikawa, I've been reading about your company's advancements in sustainable energy for your new data centers. It's fascinating work." Ishikawa's eyes lit up. "You have most people only focus on our consumer electronics. Your husband's firm, Chevalier Innovations, has been a pioneer in that field for years. We follow your lead." Richard felt the ground crumbling beneath his feet. Amelia wasn't just a trophy wife. She was speaking the language of their world, a language he always thought she was incapable of understanding. And Chevalier Innovations. That was Damien's most aggressive and profitable venture. Richard's project, which hinged on traditional carbon-heavy construction, suddenly felt archaic and clumsy. The conversation continued with Amelia asking insightful questions that had Ishikawa beaming. Richard and Kimberly were left standing on the periphery, invisible. It was the most profound social humiliation he had ever experienced. He was used to being the sun. Now he wasn't even a distant planet. Kimberly, realizing she was being ignored, tugged on his sleeve. "Ricky," she hissed, her voice a venomous whisper. "Do something. They're making us look like fools." But what could he do? Challenge Damien Chevalier to a debate on market futures? He would be eviscerated. He tried to interject. "Mr. Ishikawa, about my proposal for the Hudson Yards expansion." Ishikawa held up a hand without even looking at him. "Perhaps another time, Sterling. Mr. Chevalier. Have you considered expanding your solar panel manufacturing into Asia?" The dismissal was absolute. The deal he had been banking on, the one that was supposed to be the crowning achievement of his year, had just been jeopardized, not by a market downturn or a competitor, but by the unexpected arrival of his ex-wife. The little group, now an impenetrable circle of power, began to move away towards the VIP lounge, leaving Richard and Kimberly in their wake. The surrounding guests, who had watched the entire exchange with hawk-like intensity, now looked at Richard with a mixture of pity and morbid curiosity. The gossip was already spreading, moving through the room at the speed of light. Richard Sterling, the man who had everything, was being upstaged. His flashy, beautiful new model looked cheap and loud next to the quiet, regal elegance of Amelia. His own success felt hollow compared to the dynastic, untouchable wealth of Damien Chevalier. He grabbed another glass of champagne from a passing waiter and downed it in 2 gulps. The bubbles did nothing to calm the rage and confusion churning in his gut. This wasn't the Amelia he knew. This wasn't the woman who cried for weeks after he told her it was over. The woman who had looked so small and broken in the lawyer's office. He had to understand. How had this happened? How had the caterpillar he'd discarded not just become a butterfly, but a dragon? The story didn't make sense, and the not knowing was eating him alive. The divorce papers had felt like a death certificate, not for the marriage that had been dead for years, but for the woman Amelia thought she was. For 20 years her identity had been Mrs. Richard Sterling. She was an accessory, a manager of households, a silent partner whose contributions were never acknowledged. When Richard had sat her down in their sterile white living room and told her he wanted more, she hadn't even been surprised, just empty. He had expected a fight. Instead, she was compliant. She signed the papers, packed her bags, and left the opulent Upper East Side apartment without a backward glance. She moved into the old Connecticut house, the one place that still held memories of a time before he became consumed by his own reflection. For 3 months, she wandered its rooms like a ghost, surrounded by the ghosts of a life that was no longer hers. One rainy afternoon, while clearing out the attic, she found a box of her old college things. Tucked inside a dusty art history textbook was a faded postcard of Florence. On the back, in her own youthful script, it read, "Someday." She had dreamed of studying art restoration, of spending her days with history and beauty, of touching the canvases of masters. But she had met Richard, a charismatic and ambitious business student, and her dreams had been neatly packed away, labeled as impractical. That night, something inside her shifted. The emptiness began to feel less like a void and more like an open space. An opportunity. She wasn't Mrs. Richard Sterling anymore. She was just Amelia Hayes. And Amelia Hayes could do whatever she wanted. A month later, she was on a plane to Florence. She sold the Connecticut house, liquidated some of the stocks from the settlement, and enrolled in a prestigious intensive restoration program at the Istituto per l'Arte e il Restauro. She rented a small, sun-drenched apartment overlooking the Arno, traded her designer clothes for practical slacks and linen shirts, and threw herself into her work. For the first time in her adult life, she felt truly alive. Her hands, once used for signing off on catering menus and charity seating charts, were now carefully cleaning a 16th century fresco. Her mind, once filled with Richard's social schedule, was now grappling with chemical compositions and the delicate brushstrokes of Renaissance artists. The plainness Richard had so despised was in fact a quiet focus, an intellectual depth he had never bothered to explore. It was in the dusty, temperature-controlled archives of the Uffizi Gallery, a place she had gained access to through her program, that she met him. She was examining a collection of preparatory sketches attributed to the workshop of Verrocchio, convinced she had found an anomaly in the paper's watermark. She was so engrossed she didn't hear him approach. The chain-line measurements on that batch are inconsistent with the paper sourced from the Fabriano Mills, post-1475. A deep voice said from behind her. "You'll find the watermark is likely a later forgery, probably from the 19th century." Amelia turned, startled, to see a man in a simple but exquisitely cut linen suit. He had an air of authority, but his eyes were curious and respectful. She had seen him in the archives before, always in a quiet corner, speaking in fluent Italian with the curators. She assumed he was a visiting professor. I was just noticing that, she said, her professional instincts taking over. The artist was attempting to mimic the Verrocchio workshop's cross-hatching technique, but the pressure is too uniform. It lacks the organic variation. He stepped closer, his gaze fixed on the sketch, then on her. He smiled. "You have a remarkable eye." That was how it began. Not with champagne and compliments, but with a shared passion for the tangible echoes of history. His name was Damien. Just Damien. He never mentioned his last name or what he did. To her, he was a fellow academic, a brilliant historian with an encyclopedic knowledge of art and finance in the Renaissance. They spent weeks engaged in spirited debates over coffee in small Florentine cafes. He was fascinated by her insights, her unpretentious intelligence. He didn't care what she wore or who she knew. He was captivated by her mind. He loved the way her face lit up when she talked about pigments, the focused intensity in her eyes when she held a piece of history in her hands. He saw the fire Richard had been blind to. He courted her slowly, respectfully. He took her to see private collections hidden away in ancient palazzos, arranged for them to have dinner with the world's leading art historians, and flew them to a small Greek island on a private jet to see a newly excavated mosaic, which was the first time Amelia began to suspect he was more than just a well-connected professor. The truth came out one evening on the terrace of a villa he owned on Lake Como, a place of such staggering beauty it seemed unreal. "There's something I need to tell you, Amelia," he said, taking her hand as they watched the sunset paint the mountains in shades of rose and gold. "My name is Damien Chevalier." The name meant nothing to her at first. She had been so disconnected from Richard's world of finance and fame that it didn't register. He then explained quite simply the scale of his family's influence and his own work. He wasn't bragging. He was stating facts, worried that it might frighten her away. She looked at him, at this brilliant, kind, and fascinating man, who had truly seen her when she felt invisible. She thought of Richard, who defined himself by his wealth. And then she looked at Damien, who was defined by his passion, his intellect, and his history, and happened to be one of the richest men in the world. She smiled. "Well, Damien Chevalier," she said softly, "it's a good thing I'm not marrying you for your money then." He proposed a week later. They were married in a quiet, private ceremony at the villa, with only a handful of friends. Her transformation had nothing to do with revenge. It was the natural blossoming of a woman who was finally being watered, finally in the right soil. Damien's wealth simply gave her the resources to pursue her passions on a global scale. She didn't just study art. She began acquiring and endowing entire museum wings. She didn't just support charities. She joined their boards, using the sharp intelligence Richard had overlooked to direct their strategies and multiply their impact. She hadn't thought about Richard Sterling in months. He was a footnote in a book she had long since finished reading. But when the invitation to the Children's Foundation Gala arrived, an event she knew Richard considered his personal stage. Damien had looked at her with a knowing glint in his eye. Perhaps he'd said, a slow smile spreading across his face, "It's time for a visit to New York." The atmosphere in the ballroom had curdled. The initial shock of Amelia's arrival had given way to a palpable tension. Richard Sterling was no longer the master of ceremonies. He was the main exhibit in a public dissection. He could feel the eyes on him, the whispers that followed him as he moved aimlessly from the bar to the terrace and back again. Kimberly was furious. "This is a disaster, Ricky." She seethed her grip on his arm like a vice. "She did this on purpose. She's trying to humiliate us." "Don't be ridiculous," Richard snapped, his voice harsher than he intended. "She doesn't have the strategic thinking for a move like this. It's a fluke. She got lucky and landed a whale. But even as he said it, he knew he was wrong. The calm, calculated precision of her entrance, the way she had engaged Ishikawa, it was no accident. He was bleeding social capital with every passing minute. Old allies were suddenly busy when he approached. Business rivals were smirking at him over their glasses. He was becoming a joke, and it was a sensation he had never experienced before. His entire identity was built on being the man who always won. Fueled by a dangerous mix of champagne and wounded pride, he decided he had to confront her. He needed to re-establish the old dynamic, to remind her of who was in charge, to see a flicker of the timid woman he used to know. He found her near the silent auction tables, momentarily alone, while Damien was in conversation with a senator. She was examining a rare first edition of a classic novel, her expression one of quiet contemplation. "Quite a show you're putting on, Amelia," he began, his tone dripping with sarcasm. She didn't look up from the book immediately. When she finally did, her grey eyes were unreadable. "I have no idea what you're talking about, Richard. Don't play dumb with me. This whole entrance, the dress, the jewels, bringing him—" He gestured vaguely in Damien's direction. "You came here tonight to stick a knife in me." A small, almost pitying smile touched her lips. "You give yourself too much credit. My life no longer revolves around you, Richard. It doesn't even include you. I'm here because I believe in the Foundation's work. My husband is here because he believes in me." Her composure was infuriating. He wanted a reaction. He wanted tears, anger, anything but this placid superiority. He lowered his voice, making it cruel. "You can wear all the jewels in the world, Amelia, but it doesn't change what you are. You're still that boring little librarian who was terrified of her own shadow. How long do you think it will take him to figure that out? To get tired of you and trade you in for a newer model? It's what men like us do." It was a low blow, designed to hit her where she was most insecure. But the woman standing before him wasn't the same one he had left. She finally closed the book and gave him her full attention. The pity in her eyes was gone, replaced by something as hard and cold as steel. "There are two differences between you and Damien, Richard. The first is that he is a man of substance, so he is drawn to substance in others. You are a man of surfaces, so you are drawn to surfaces. That is why you have Kimberly, and he has me." Richard flinched as if he'd been slapped. The second difference, she continued, her voice dropping to a near whisper, "is that you were so busy looking at my surface that you never bothered to see what was underneath. You thought my quietness was weakness. It was patience. You thought my lack of interest in your social climbing was a flaw. It was a different set of values. You were a chapter in my life. A short, rather uninteresting chapter, I now realize. And I am quite happy to have turned the page." Before he could formulate a response, Damien was at her side, his presence a silent, immovable wall. He had clearly heard the end of their conversation. His piercing blue eyes locked onto Richard's. "Is there a problem here, Sterling?" Damien's voice was dangerously quiet. "Just catching up with an old friend," Richard said, trying to sound nonchalant. "I think the conversation is over," Damien stated. He then glanced at Richard's lapel. "That's an interesting project you're proposing for the Hudson Yards, the one you're courting Ishikawa for." Richard was stunned. How did he know the details? "It's going to be a landmark," he blustered, trying to seize the opportunity to regain some footing. "A revolutionary design." Damien's lips curved into a smile that held no humor. "Revolutionary. It's a glass and steel box running on a conventional power grid. My wife called it aggressively uninspired. He paused, letting the insult land. But the location has potential. He looked over at Mr. Ishikawa, who was now watching them intently. Kenji, he called out, his voice carrying easily across the space. I've been thinking about your desire for a flagship North American headquarters. Ishikawa hurried over. Sterling's project is dead. Damien said the words delivered with the finality of a judge's gavel. The zoning board will never approve it, as is not with the city's new green energy mandates. I happen to know the primary landowner of that parcel. He's an old friend. Richard's blood turned to ice. He was the primary landowner. He owned it through a series of shell corporations. How could Chevalier know? However, Damien continued, his gaze still fixed on Ishikawa. My firm, Chevalier Innovations, has been working on a new architectural model, a completely self-sustaining arcology carbon neutral that would not only meet the city's mandates, but set a new global standard. We were looking for the right flagship partner to launch it with. He then looked at Amelia. My wife was the one who initially drafted the philanthropic and community integration framework for the design. Ishikawa's jaw was practically on the floor. He looked from Damien's confident face to Richard's ashen one. The choice was obvious. He was being offered a chance to partner with a legend on a world-changing project, versus dealing with a flailing developer whose project was apparently doomed. Mr. Chevalier Ishikawa said, bowing again, I would be very, very interested to hear more. Damien clapped him on the shoulder. Excellent. My team will call your team in the morning. He then turned his chilling gaze back to Richard, one last time. You see, Sterling, you traffic in buildings. I traffic in futures. Don't ever speak to my wife that way again. It was a checkmate. In less than 5 minutes, Damien had not only defended Amelia's honor, but had also publicly humiliated Richard, befriended his target investor, and decapitated his company's flagship project. Richard Sterling stood there completely and utterly broken as Amelia and Damien walked away, leaving him in the ruins of his own making. The public execution was over, but the ghost of the guillotine lingered in the air, visible only to Richard. The polite applause for the orchestra's latest piece sounded like a death knell in his ears. He stood paralyzed, a statue of a man in a Brioni suit, while the world he had so meticulously constructed was being dismantled around him, brick by gilded brick. Damien Chevalier's words echoed in his mind, a relentless, torturous loop. Sterling's project is dead. My wife called it aggressively uninspired. Don't ever speak to my wife that way again. It wasn't just the loss of the Ishikawa deal. It was the sheer, effortless totality of his defeat. He had been swatted aside, not like a rival, but like a fly. He stumbled towards the bar, his movements stiff and uncoordinated, feeling the phantom weight of hundreds of pairs of eyes on his back. He ordered a Macallan 25 neat, needing the burn of something expensive and potent to cauterize the gaping wound in his ego. The bartender who had been fawning over him an hour ago now served him with a brisk, almost pitying efficiency. The power dynamic had shifted, and everyone in the room down to the staff was aware of it. He surveyed the room from his lonely perch. The atmosphere had changed irrevocably. The gala was no longer a celebration. It was a crime scene, and he was the chalk outline on the floor. The clusters of guests were tighter now, their heads bent together in conspiratorial whispers. He could almost hear the words carried on the air currents, like poison spores. Did you see his face absolutely ashen? Chevalier didn't even raise his voice. That's real power. He bet the farm on that Hudson Yards deal. He's leveraged to the hilt. And the ex-wife. My God, It's like a Greek tragedy, or a comedy depending on your perspective. He looked for Kimberly, his beautiful, flawless distraction. He needed her on his arm, a shield of perfection to deflect the scorn. He needed her to whisper reassurances in his ear, to tell him he was still the king. He found her standing near a marble column, her back to him. But she wasn't looking for him. Her posture was rigid, a predator's stillness. He watched as she took a delicate sip of her champagne, her eyes scanning the crowd with a frantic, calculating intensity. He recognized the look. It was the same one she had when she was scanning the jewelry displays at Tiffany's, assessing value-weighing options and deciding which piece had the most potential for appreciation. He started to move towards her, but stopped. He saw her gaze land on Carter Prescott, a young, ferociously ambitious hedge fund manager, known for his ruthless trades and his portfolio of tech startups that had exploded in value. Prescott was the new face of Wall Street, younger, hungrier, and more attuned to the future than Richard's old-world real estate plays. To the room, Carter was the future. Richard, as of 10 minutes ago, was the past. Kimberly's entire demeanor shifted. The rigid tension in her shoulders melted away, replaced by a fluid, serpentine grace. A dazzling smile, the one Richard had paid to perfect, bloomed on her face. She glided towards Carter Prescott, her crimson dress a slash of intent against the ballroom's muted tones. Richard watched his stomach churning as she initiated the conversation. He couldn't hear the words, but he knew the script. The feigned interest, the light touch on the arm, the head tilted just so, allowing her diamond earrings a gift from Richard for closing the preliminary financing on the now-dead project to catch the light. She was abandoning him. The thought was so shocking, so fundamentally contrary to his understanding of their arrangement, that he felt a fresh wave of nausea. He hadn't just acquired her. He had created her. He had plucked her from obscurity, funded her wardrobe, her apartment, her very existence in this world. She was his creation, his possession, and yet he was now watching his prize possession appraise a new owner right before his eyes. The loyalty he had assumed was part of the package was proving to be a phantom clause in their unwritten contract. His phone vibrated in his pocket, a jarring buzz against his thigh. He pulled it out. A text from his CFO, Patrick O'Connell. "Call me, now. The rumors are already hitting the Asian markets. Our bondholders are panicking. Is it true, what they're saying? Did Chevalier personally sink the Ishikawa deal in the middle of the gala? We need to issue a statement before the pre-market opens in New York, or we're going to be slaughtered." Richard's hand trembled as he read the message. It was real. The abstract, social humiliation had now crossed the veil into tangible, catastrophic financial reality. He could visualize the red downward arrows on the stock tickers, feel the impending avalanche of margin calls and angry investors. The empire he had built on a foundation of bravado and risk was now facing an earthquake it could not withstand. He couldn't breathe. He looked up, desperate for a distraction from the abyss opening beneath him, and his eyes landed on them. Amelia and Damien. They were standing with the senator from New York, engaged in a quiet, relaxed conversation. Damien wasn't boasting or holding court. He was listening, and Amelia at his side wasn't a silent accessory. She interjected with a thoughtful point about urban green spaces, and the senator nodded, genuinely impressed. They were a team, a true partnership. The sight of their easy synergistic power was a stark, brutal contrast to the transactional fragility of his relationship with Kimberly. A voice thin and reedy sliced through his stupor. "Richard, darling, He turned to find Beatrice Astor Winthrop, the 80-year-old matriarch of a family whose name was etched onto half the museum wings in the city. Her face, a road map of wrinkles and disdain, was arranged in an expression of deep concern that was utterly transparent. "I was just saying to the Rockefellers," she began, her voice loud enough for those nearby to hear, "what a dreadfully unlucky turn of events for you. To have it happen so publicly." But she leaned in her perfume, a cloying cloud of lily of the valley. "One must be terribly proud of dear Amelia. What a remarkable turnaround. We always thought she was a quiet little thing, but it seems there was a lioness in there all along. It just goes to show, doesn't it? It takes the right kind of man to know how to handle a lioness." She patted his arm, with a hand laden with heirloom rings. Each tap a tiny condescending nail in his social coffin. The insult was exquisite in its construction, simultaneously pitying him for his failure and crediting another man for unlocking the potential of the woman he had discarded as worthless. Reeling from the blow, he turned his gaze back toward Kimberly, a last desperate hope. He saw her laughing at something Carter Prescott had said. Then the final, undeniable act of betrayal. She subtly angled her body away from the room, pulling out her slim rose gold phone. She handed it to Carter, who quickly tapped his details into it. A digital handshake, sealing a new alliance. She took her phone back, and for a fleeting, fatal second, her eyes met Richard's from across the room. There was no apology in her gaze. No regret, no sympathy. There was only a cold, dispassionate assessment, the look a stockbroker gives a failing company on a screen before hitting the sell button. She gave him the smallest, most infinitesimal shake of her head, a silent, final confirmation. The position is closed. The asset has been liquidated. Then, with a final brilliant smile at Carter Prescott, she turned and walked towards the exit, her new prospect falling into step beside her. The crimson dress, the dress he had chosen, the dress that was supposed to symbolize his victory, tonight, was the last thing he saw before she vanished into the lobby and out of his life. The Gilded Rat had not just deserted the ship. She had already boarded a new, more seaworthy vessel, leaving him alone on the deck to go down with the wreck. The Gala was dying. It was a slow, graceful death, but a death nonetheless. The orchestra had packed their instruments, replaced by the funereal hum of industrial vacuum cleaners in distant corridors. The grand floral arrangements, once so vibrant, now seemed to droop with the weight of the evening's secrets. The remaining guests, the true night owls and most dedicated gossips, were clustered near the exit, their hushed tones and frequent glances in his direction making Richard feel like an animal in a zoo long after closing time. He remained at the bar, a fixed point, in a dissolving world, the amber of his fourth scotch, the only warm color in his grayscale existence. He was no longer just embarrassed or angry. A profound, chilling solitude had begun to set in. He had lost his mistress, his reputation, his life's work, and the respect of his peers, all in the time it takes to drink a bottle of champagne. He was adrift in the wreckage, and the only person who held the map to how it all happened was preparing to leave. He saw them near the grand staircase, bathed in the soft glow of the sconces. A valet was holding a simple, elegant cashmere shawl, and Damien was carefully draping it over Amelia's shoulders. The gesture was intimate, protective, and utterly devoid of the performative nature that had defined Richard's own public affections for Kimberly. They were a self-contained unit, a fortress of two ready to depart the battlefield where they had so soundly vanquished him. A venomous, desperate thought began to form in Richard's mind. This couldn't be a coincidence. The plain, timid Amelia he knew couldn't have accidentally stumbled into this new life and coincidentally appeared at his moment of triumph to destroy him. It was impossible. His ego, the very engine of his being, refused to accept a narrative in which he was merely collateral damage in her story of success. No, he had to be the target. This entire 2-year production, her move to Europe, her meeting Chevalier, her transformation, it had to be a long, brilliantly executed revenge plot, a vendetta of Shakespearean proportions. He needed to believe it. Believing he was the object of such a grand Machiavellian scheme was the only way to salvage a shred of his own importance from the evening's wreckage. To be a hated, defeated villain was still a role of significance. The alternative that his downfall was a mere footnote in her ascendancy was a truth too devastating to contemplate. Fueled by this last surge of defiant pride, he pushed himself off the bar stool and strode towards them, his steps unnervingly loud in the cavernous, emptying ballroom. He cut off their path to the exit, forcing them to stop and look at him. Amelia. His voice was a raw, broken thing. She turned her face calm, her grey eyes holding an expression he couldn't immediately decipher. It wasn't anger or fear. It was a profound, soul-deep weariness, the look a historian might give a belligerent tourist arguing about a settled fact. Damien stood beside her, his hand resting lightly on her back, a silent, watchful guardian. "I have to know," Richard began the words, tumbling out, fueled by scotch and desperation. "Why?" After all of it. The quiet divorce taking the settlement, disappearing. Was it all for this performance tonight? Find the biggest shark in the ocean so you could come back and sink my little fleet. Was this whole marriage? He gestured wildly at Damien. Just some elaborate 2-year-long game to get back at me. To ruin me. He searched her face for a flicker of triumph, for the confession that would validate his theory, and in a twisted way, restore his place at the center of her universe. He found none. Instead, Amelia's lips curved into a sad, gentle smile. It was a smile of such profound pity that it stung him more than any insult. "Oh, Richard," she said, her voice soft, yet it carried an immense weight, easily cutting through the cavernous space. "Even now, after everything, you still think the world revolves around you. You look at my life, and the only way you can make sense of it is to see it as a reflection of your own. That is, and always has been, your greatest flaw." She took a single deliberate step forward, closing the distance slightly. Damien's hand never left her back. "You ask if this was about revenge. Revenge is an admission of pain. It's a declaration that the other person still has power over you. For the first year after you left, I was in pain. But revenge, I quickly learned that revenge is a poison you drink, hoping the other person will die. I was never interested in poison, Richard. I was interested in the antidote." His face must have shown his confusion, because she continued her voice like a teacher patiently explaining a complex theorem. "The antidote was discovering that my life wasn't over. It had just been on pause. You didn't ruin me when you walked out that door. You opened it. You thought you were casting me out into the wilderness, but you were kicking a bird out of a cage it had forgotten had a door. My journey wasn't away from you. It was towards myself. The woman you see tonight wasn't created to spite you. She was unearthed when you were no longer standing in the way, casting your long shadow over her. Every word was a precise surgical strike, dismantling his last pathetic defense. I went to Florence to find a passion I had buried, to support yours. I fell in love with art, with history, with myself. I met Damien not because I was hunting for a billionaire, but because I found a man who saw me not as an accessory, but as an equal. His love was a consequence of my freedom, not the reason for it. This life, she gestured to herself, the emeralds at her throat glittering like defiant stars, is not a reaction to you. You aren't that important, Richard. You weren't the villain of my story. You were just the prologue. A short, rather uninteresting chapter that was necessary to get to the good part. Her final words hung in the air, a devastating verdict on his role in her life. She turned to leave her back a statement of finality. It was too much. The pity, the dismissal, the sheer insignificance she assigned to him, it broke the last thread of his control. In a final, primal act of desperation, he reached out and grabbed her arm, his fingers closing around the delicate cashmere of her shawl. Amelia, wait. It was an instinctual act of possession, a throwback to a time when he believed he had the right. Before his grip could even tighten, Damien's hand clamped down on his wrist. The movement was impossibly fast, unnervingly silent. There was no aggression in it, no fury. It was the cold, impersonal application of immense force. The pressure was absolute, like his bones were caught in a hydraulic press. It didn't just stop him, it paralyzed him. Richard looked from the iron grip on his wrist to Damien's face. The man's piercing blue eyes were not angry. They were glacial. They held a calm, terrifying promise of consequences so severe Richard couldn't begin to imagine them. A dead silence stretched for a full 3 seconds. "You will unhand my wife," Damien said. His voice wasn't a shout. It was a low, resonant command that vibrated through Richard's very bones. Now. Richard's fingers flew open as if he had touched a live wire. He snatched his hand back, cradling his wrist, the ghost of that immense pressure still there. Amelia didn't flinch. She simply adjusted her shawl and, without giving Richard another glance, turned and walked away. Her final act was not triumph, but indifference. And that was the cruelest cut of all. Damien held Richard's gaze for one more chilling moment before turning to follow his wife. Richard watched them go, their footsteps echoing on the marble, a steady, unified rhythm. He watched as they passed through the grand archway, silhouettes against the city lights, and disappeared. The heavy oak doors swung shut behind them, the soft click of the latch sounding as final as a tomb ceiling. He was alone, utterly and completely alone, in the center of the dimming ballroom, the architect of his own magnificent ruin, with nothing but the silence and the crushing weight of a truth he could no longer deny. And so Richard Sterling's world didn't end with a bang, but with the quiet, dignified exit of a woman he never truly knew. He learned the hard way that a person's worth isn't determined by the label you put on them, but by the strength and resilience they find within themselves. Amelia's story isn't one of revenge. It's a story of rebirth. It's a powerful reminder that sometimes the worst thing that can ever happen to you, a betrayal, a heartbreak being cast aside, can be the very thing that sets you free to become the person you were always meant to be. She didn't need to ruin her ex-husband's life. She just needed to build her own. And in doing so, she showed everyone, including him, that the best comeback is not to stoop to their level, but to rise so far above it that they are no longer even in view. What did you think of Amelia's incredible transformation? Was Richard's downfall deserved. Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. And if you love stories of epic comebacks and sweet, sweet justice, make sure to hit that like button, share this video with someone who needs to hear it, and subscribe to our channel for more unforgettable stories.